We all know the image. A green-faced old woman with a hooked nose flying through the air on a broomstick. Or more recently, a cute young woman. Either way, one of the first few things that people ask me when they find out I'm a witch is, do you fly your broom to work? Or some other silly question having to do with flying. But where did that come from? And why? It seems so ridiculous, doesn't it? Surely witches don't fly, and certainly not on brooms, right? Hey, I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey. So I'm just dying to dig into this episode because I just thought it was the craziest thing ever, and I so want to share it with you. A little bit of a disclaimer though. If you've got kiddos around for this episode, I might suggest some earbuds. This is also one of those not safe for work kind of episodes. I mean, let's face it, most of my episodes aren't safe for work. I don't know how many people listen to witchy podcasts at work, but I'm not about to assume anything. I don't want to get you sent to HR. So this is me giving you a little bit of time to pause this so you can listen later. I also want to take the time to say, as I've said before, I'm not a doctor. I don't have a PhD in anything. I'm just the super nerdy witch who likes to fill her brain with as much info as it can hold, okay? So before you decide to try flying on your own, I would suggest learning as much as you can about all of that. Consulting your doctor about potential allergies or medication mixture side effects, and consulting an herbalist. Or maybe just don't attempt that part at all. Oh yeah, I almost got ahead of myself. Today's card. We're going to switch it up a little bit and pull from a beautiful oracle deck called Elemental Empath. Don't ask me why, I just feel like something needs to come out here. Our card today tells us to feel emotions. Now, we all feel our emotions, don't we? The real question is whether or not we understand the emotions that we feel. On the surface of it, sure. We were taught what each emotion looks like, what each one is called, and all of that. But to understand them, to navigate them, to connect them deeper than the surface level, we were not taught that. Or rather, many of us weren't taught that. Let's take a moment to reflect on the current emotion that you're feeling. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to analyze it right now. But can you identify how you feel right now, at this moment? Whatever that emotion is, it's okay to feel it. Try to set aside anything telling you that the emotion shouldn't be there. It's allowed to take that space, and it has a reason for being there. That's not to say that I encourage spiraling. There's a difference between pausing to identify, recognize, and feel an emotion, and feeding that emotion in a way that makes it worse and extends the time that we're feeling it. It's not an easy balance, especially when those emotions are connected to grief and fear. How do we find that balance? How do we process our emotions? We should keep in mind that our emotions don't define us. We experience them. It's helpful to reword things from that perspective. It's not to make those emotions any less valid, but to help keep you from getting stuck in them, like quicksand. On the other side of the coin, the goal isn't to ignore the emotions, like many of us are taught to do from a young age, but to allow them to show up for what they are. For the next couple of days, if you experience a notable emotional shift, pause and see if you can identify it, and then ask yourself where in your body you're feeling that emotion. Is it a tightness in your chest that might be signaling fear? Is it an empty feeling in your stomach that might be signaling sadness? Is it a lightness in your feet that's signaling joy? They may signal from different places in your own body, so see if you can pinpoint where you can feel it. For now, practice building your awareness around them. Okay, deep breath. And let's set that aside for now because I did kind of spring that on you. Witches on brooms. What the hell is that all about? Today, it's a well-known Halloween icon. I'm sure one of the first few things that come to mind aside from Halloween is the Harry Potter fantasy series. Don't get me wrong, I would love to be able to fly like that. Imagine the amount of gas you'd save from not having to drive. I live in a pretty rural area where you have to drive to really be able to get anywhere. But alas, we're stuck with driving. I suppose that isn't so bad, though. It beats getting splinters in a rather uncomfortable place. and flying in the rain would present difficulties, like a slippery broom and visibility issues. And how would one maintain their balance, even on a good day? In one discussion thread I came across, someone asked an excellent question. How would a broomstick be able to hold the weight of a whole person, plus a possible familiar and a pouch? One answer I thought was funny was a reference to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, wherein a witch weighs the same as a duck, and by that logic would be able to ride atop a broom if they could get the broom in flight by magic. Silly ponderings aside, though, the image has to come from somewhere. So, where? There's a lot to unpack here. To be able to make the most sense of it all, let's address the creation of the broom first. A broom is a household tool used for sweeping, essential to hearth and kitchen cleanliness. This is something that we all know. The word broom potentially derives from the Old English word basum and the Proto-Germanic word bromus, and means thorny shrub. It seems as though brooms have taken on the name of the plant which the bristles were made from, whatever common broom tree shrubs were native to any given region. We don't have an exact date for the invention of the broom, but we do know they go back to very ancient times, when a handful of twigs would be used to clear away ash from fires. At some point, people started to tie bundles of twigs together for the same purpose. And then later on, people figured out that if you tied your bundle of twigs to a stick, you didn't have to crouch to sweep. You could sweep standing up. We don't have a timeline for any of that, but we know that the broom is mentioned in the New Testament, which dates back to the 1st or 2nd century, and didn't evolve much until the modern-day flat brooms, the ones that we're used to seeing. Those were created in 1798 by a man named Theodore Bates, who was a member of the Watervliet Shaker community in New York. The broom vise that he's been credited with inventing built on the existing round broom that was popularized by Levi Dickinson of Massachusetts the previous year, in 1797. By 1800, brooms had become a staple in the household. So now that we've established that some form of broom has been around probably almost as long as people have been building fires indoors, let's move our focus to the Middle Ages. That's a broad time frame. The Middle Ages spans from the 5th to 15th century, so let's start at the end of the Middle Ages. Guillaume Edelin was the first to confess to riding on a broom. He was a priest from Saint-Germain-en-Laye in Paris. Yes, I said he. Guillaume was arrested in 1453 and tried for witchcraft because he publicly criticized the church's warnings about witchcraft. He had confessed under torture, because who wouldn't? And though he retracted his confession later on, he remained imprisoned for life. Let's not forget that in Guillaume's time there was a lot of fear and suspicion surrounding those who didn't behave as expected. 2 years previous to that, in 1451, 2 illustrations in Le Champion de Dames, or The Defender of Ladies, written by poet Martin Lefranc, depicted 2 ladies, one riding a broom and the other riding what appears to be a stick. These are the first images of witches on brooms that we know of. The interesting thing with these illustrations is that both of the ladies are wearing headscarves that identify them as Waldensians. They're a Christian sect that was founded in the 12th century and were branded as heretics by the Catholic Church for, among a list of other things, allowing women to become priests. But that wasn't even the first time that witches were suspected of flying on brooms. Let's rewind a little more. Ireland, 1324. Lady Alice Kettler was tried for sorcery. Investigators had been sent to her home to gather evidence against her, and they, quote, found a pipe of ointment, wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she ambled and galloped through thick and thin, end quote. Ointment, you say? Now, in 1250, or maybe 1260, we have one of the first mentions of an ointment in a roundabout connection with flying on brooms. This appears in Albertus Magnus's De Vegetabilibus Libri, and though it doesn't directly reference flying, it does state, quote, but those who study necromancy teach that the symbol of a thorn bush should be painted on a person when they make invocations of demons, end quote. Per historical records, the smoke from henbane may have been what was used as a sort of incense for this ritual at the time. I find it interesting that This was written at a time when one could be punished with legal penalties and religious and societal ostracization when it came to any acts that were considered sexually deviant by the Catholic Church. Participation in a ritual such as this would probably have fallen under that umbrella because of their ideas around invoking demons. I could seriously go on a tangent here about that, so we're going to throw a little sticky note tab on it and come back to it some other time. 7 years after Albertus Magnus wrote about the study of necromancy, Theodoric of Servia wrote that the desired mixture for flying was one of henbane, mandrake, hemlock, lettuce, opium, ivy, climbing ivy, lapithum, juice from an unripe mulberry, and spurge flax. The concoction would be soaked into a sponge and inhaled. I'm going to say it again. I don't recommend attempting this, especially if you don't have extensive herbal knowledge. A number of the herbs mentioned in Theodoric's recipe are labeled poisonous. Now, pretty much all throughout the Middle Ages, witches were thought to concoct brews and salves from plants like deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, and jimsonweed. Most of what we know about medieval witchcraft, though, comes from people like religious inquisitors, legal officials, and testimony from accused witches who were often tortured until a confession was made. So we do need to take that information with a grain of salt, because the folks in charge of arresting and interrogating accused witches definitely had an agenda. However, there is enough to suggest that the idea of flying wasn't completely made up to look like witches conspired with the devil or whatever. There may have been some truth to it, to a certain extent. In a text by theologian Jordanus de Bergamo, circa 1470, we find the suggestion that, quote, on certain days or nights, they anoint a staff and ride it to the appointed place, or anoint themselves under the arms and other hairy places, end quote. Now, many of the depictions of witches on brooms are of them either partially clothed or completely naked astride their brooms, which suggests that when Jordanus says other hairy places, well, you can probably guess what I'm getting at there. Now, there is some science behind that. See, historical accounts show that people figured out that ingesting certain substances would cause intestinal distress, rashes, nausea, or even death, and that an alternative way was to absorb the substance through the skin in intimate areas of the body, where sweat glands and mucous membranes are. Absorbing through the skin, or using a transvection ointment, meant bypassing the body's ability to run the substance through the first stage of metabolism, digestion, therefore bypassing the intestinal distress, making it less potent and giving it a slower release. Now, this is where things get even more interesting. Something else was also happening around the time that these ointments were supposedly being discovered by officials. From the 14th century to the 17th century, Europe was being afflicted with something called dancing mania. People would be in the streets, dancing, foaming at the mouth, and speaking nonsense, unable to stop dancing until they eventually collapsed from exhaustion, injuries, or death. Those that survived would later tell of wild visions. I'm not just talking about a few people here and there. Sometimes they were numbered in the thousands. One of the first major outbreaks was in 1374, in what is now Germany, though there are accounts of outbreaks as early as the 7th century. These outbreaks appear to happen most often and to the largest amounts of people during times of hardship. I would say the numerous occasions of witch trials throughout Europe would count as times of hardship because one had to be very careful about everything they did or said in order to avoid being accused. Combine that with the living conditions of the average citizen and the fact that they had to rely on crop growth and being able to harvest it all in order to survive each year, and I'm sure there was plenty of hardship to go around. Now, at that point in time, one of the food staples was bread, primarily rye bread. There is a common fungus that grows on crops, such as the rye plant, which is where the rye grain comes from in order to make rye flour. This fungus is called ergot. Ingestion of ergot can cause a person to experience an LSD-like high. Side note, long-term exposure to the fungus causes what's called ergotism, which presents itself by way of symptoms like mania, convulsions, spasms, diarrhea, and gangrene, just to name a few. The cause of the LSD-like high, though, is because ergot produces an alkaloid that can cause hallucinations. The theory is that certain people began experimenting with it and other plants that produce hallucinogenic alkaloids. Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician and occultist, called the results of these experiments flying ointment in his work Prestigious Demonum, circa 1563. Why flying? Tropane alkaloids tend to cause sleep, and during that sleep, the person experiences very vivid dreams involving flying. In 1545, a physician named André de Laguna handled a potion that was made by an accused witch. Supposedly it contained hemlock, nightshade, henbane, and mandrake, and administered it to another female and recorded, "She fell into such a profound sleep that I thought I should never be able to wake her." Luckily, 36 hours later, he was finally able to rouse her, but she was quite upset about it, saying that she was surrounded by all the delights in the world. How dare he wake her? We do have a more recent experiment, though, one from 1966. German writer Gustav Schenk recorded his own personal experience with inhaling the smoke from burning henbane. He wrote, "My teeth were clenched, and a dizzied rage took possession of me. I was permeated with a peculiar sense of well-being connected with the crazy sensation that my feet were growing lighter, expanding, and breaking loose from my body. Each part of my body seemed to be going off on its own, and I was seized with fear that I was falling apart. At the same time, I experienced an intoxicating sensation of flying. I soared with my hallucinations, the clouds, the lowering sky, herds of beasts, falling leaves, billows of streamers of steam, and rivers of molten metal were swirling along." So we can see that there is likely some truth to the idea of hallucinogenic ointments being used by witches. Whether or not they were applying them to broomsticks or a staff in order to absorb them is less likely. In Reginald Scott's work, The Discovery of Witchcraft, dated for 1584, he writes that, "At these magical assemblies the witches never fail to dance. Whilst they sing and dance, every one hath a broom in her hand and holds it aloft," speaking of a fertility ritual for a bountiful crop harvest, suggesting that witches with brooms actually have roots in pagan crop fertility rituals rather than the sexualized version that comes up in confessions from accused witches. These fertility rituals don't appear to have much connection to the ointments, though. Instead, it's proposed that these rituals involved people using sticks, brooms, pitchforks, etc. in dances and jumping as high as they could to encourage the growth of crops. The broom was also used in marriage rituals, where the couple would jump over it as it was held horizontal, or just lying on the ground, to represent them starting on the journey of doing life together, not just in crossing over a threshold-like representation, but also symbolizing the balancing or coming together of energies in their union. Some speculate that it's because the broom handle was considered the male energy and the bristles of the broom symbolized the female energy. My thought is, yes, witches had brooms, and yes, witches used herbs to make an ointment, but not necessarily for putting on a broom so they could fly. It was much more likely that the salves or ointments, or even the inhalation of the smoke from certain herbs, were used in connection with divination, communicating with the gods and goddesses, astral projection, and probably even inner reflection. Basically, it wasn't for physical flying. It was for spiritual flying. But, remember how I said there's a lot to unpack? Here's another layer. In 1428, Matuccia de Francesco, an Italian nun and accused witch, was reported to have confessed that she made a flying ointment containing bat blood, vulture fat, and the blood of a newborn baby. 8 years later, Johannes Neider, in his work Formicarius, wrote that boiled unbaptized babies were the central ingredient. Yeah, I made the same face when I read that. The reason that these more gruesome ingredients began to be included was because of the church's mission to paint witches and pagans as evil, devil-worshipping villains who were planning to overthrow Christian Europe. Let's go back to the 1st and 2nd centuries for a moment. Location? Rome. Circumstances? A group of former apocalyptic Jews who have renamed themselves Christians make their way into Rome. It was written by Christian apologist Minucius Felix that this group would cover a child in dough, stab it, and drink its blood. This act was to bind them together in Jesus' name. And that was coming from someone who supposedly defended Christianity. Once Christianity rose in power after the fall of Rome, they cast these same aspersions onto any group that they deemed heretical. What they deemed heretical morphed over time to include psychedelics usage, which no one cared much about until the church claimed it was a problem. Claims that the children the heretics were supposedly eating or drinking from were born of unholy unions, and eventually the diabolical element of either invoking the devil, demons, or some other supernatural entity. By the 1400s, the focus shifted from casting these aspersions on heretics to casting them onto witches and whatever remained of pagans. Why? Because these people didn't fall in line exactly with how the church saw things. The hypocrisy is astounding. Anyway, there's one more layer to this that I want to share with you. When you think of brooms, what's the general mundane thought that tends to come to mind? Women, right? Brooms are strongly associated with women. It's a powerful symbol of feminine domesticity. It's the sign of proper behavior, meaning the woman keeping the home clean in the eyes of the patriarchy. The broom is also seen as a phallic symbol, too. Riding a broom symbolized feminine domesticity gone wild, and the embracing of feminine sexuality, which, if you know anything about the time frame of history that we've centered on today, you know that women were not allowed to do any such thing as embrace their sexuality. In the 16th and 17th centuries, images and claims of witches flying out of the home via the chimney started popping up. Some think that this is because the woman's role in the household, per the organized religion, was becoming more and more solidified, and the idea of witches in general was already a threat to the church. So a witch on a broom, especially one leaving the home by way of the chimney, symbolized breaking away from domestic customs. Think about it. A witch, who was someone that could use herbs and energy in nature to heal or hurt, which would have been considered by the church to be powers that only God or Jesus should have, combined with the broom and the anxieties and paranoia of the church. Oh boy. Women's sexuality, use of psychedelic plants for the purpose of spiritual enlightenment and divination, and religious freedom? Whoa now. Couldn't be allowing that, could they? So what are some ways to use the broom in witchcraft? No, we won't be using them to fly. Sorry. The most common is for clearing away negative energy from a space, especially prior to a ritual. Typically, you sweep from west to east, supporting the natural movement of the sun through the sky. This doesn't mean actually sweeping the floor itself, but using the sweeping motion through the air to clear the unwanted energy. If you have multiple brooms, you can use them to create a physical circle of protection. The inside of the circle is where your sacred space would be for ritual work. If you've seen Practical Magic, then you have an idea of how that works and a visual for if you're considering getting a few like-minded people together for some ritual work and want to include brooms. Like I mentioned before, some wedding rituals involve the couple jumping or stepping over a broom to signify the transition from one chapter of life to another, also signifying a willingness to sweep away the past in this new union and balancing of male and female energies. Brooms can also be used as amulets in the household. Hang a broom over your front door or window to prevent gossip, protect from curses, and keep away unwanted guests. Some believe that brooms can help attract good luck and prosperity to the home. It really all depends on the energy and intentions that you put into your broom. The material that your broom is made of can also have an effect. That's not to say that you can't just go out and purchase a mass-produced broom, but there's something magical about making your own. If making your own is something you're interested in doing, then you'll need some materials. You can either go on an adventure into the woods near where you are, and you can harvest it yourself, or you can purchase from a craft store or online. When selecting wood for the handle of your broom, willow or hazel are suggested as popular choices due to durability and strength. Willow gives the added properties of healing and protection, while hazel gives the added properties of protection and divination. When selecting materials for the bristles, birch twigs are the traditional choice when a broom tree shrub isn't available due to the durability and ability to sweep away debris. The added properties provided by birchwood are protection and purification. Other popular choices are ash or oak. But really, any twigs that are flexible and durable for sweeping are a good choice. Twine, thin rope, or string are good choices for attaching your twig bristles to your broom handle. And with making your own broom, or besom as many choose to call it, you are able to get creative with it, whether that means adding ribbons, paint, carvings, or crystals. If you harvest your own materials for your broom or besom, I would suggest allowing them to dry first. Sometimes that can take anywhere from a few weeks for twigs to a few months for branches. Personally, I have some willow branches that have been sitting out to dry for about a year at this point. But of course, it's up to you. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me today. Next time we hang out, it'll be the summer solstice. And you can bet that we'll be talking about another Wiccan Wheel of the Year celebration, Litha. If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss out on future episodes, hit those like and follow buttons. I have so much more waiting to be shared with you. For now, you can find me on Facebook, Witchful Journey Podcast, on Instagram at _Witchful_Journey. For those of you that need a reminder, the underscores are the spaces with the little lines at the bottom. On BlueSky at awitchfuljourney.bsky.social, and on YouTube, A Witchful Journey. I enjoy hearing from listeners, so if you pop in, say hi, leave me a rating, or if you're really feeling it, a review. You can also email me, awitchfuljourney@gmail.com. I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey.